What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Hope you're all doing well. If you guys have recently been seeing some of the videos I put out, you know that I covered two Brazilian films that did really well for me here on the channel. I'm Still Here, which is a brand new film that's getting a lot of love at the Oscars this season, as well as Central Station from the late 90s from the same director, Walter Salles. So I asked people to leave me some comments down below in those videos of what other Brazilian films I should watch, and I got hundreds of recommendations. And the most popular one I saw was the film we're going to be talking about today, a film that I'd heard of, that was very popular, and a poster I'd seen many times, and it's finally time to talk about it. And that film is called City of God. Let's take a trip back to 2002 now for a film directed by Fernando Meirelles and Kátia Lund, and is written by Braulio Mantovani and stars people like Alexandre Rodrigues, Leandro, Firmino, Alice Braga, and many more. And before we get too far into this video, as I typically like to say, if you're a fan of retrospective reviews like this, early or up-to-date reviews, live streams, and the occasional vlog, then you're in the right place, and I'd like to ask you to consider subscribing. But if you're a returning viewer, well, thanks so much for coming back. And today we're going to be talking about City of God. I already mentioned this is a film that tons of people have recommended to me, so I was really excited to jump on it, as so many people told me so many good things about this film. This film actually was nominated for a few Oscars, won over 70 awards at other shows, and was nominated for 50 other awards that it didn't win. All in all, this was a film that got a lot of love in the early 2000s, and the poster to me is kind of iconic. I'd seen the poster for it so many times, but just never saw this movie. And honestly, I didn't even know what this movie was about. I'd never seen a trailer, I'd never read a synopsis, so I went in blind. But I was warned by a lot of the people in the comment section for my video for Central Station that this film does get pretty dark, and it does indeed. So before we get into my thoughts on the film, let's get into what this movie is all about. City of God is seen through the lens and narrated by the character of Rocket, played by Alexandre Rodrigues. He plays a character who's an aspiring photographer, but it just so happens that he lives in the slums and has been surrounded by poverty and crime, gang violence, and all different things like that. Over the course of the film, we'd see his family members as well as his friends who end up perishing or being sucked into this world of crime. And in a lot of ways, this film is just about the cyclical nature of violence, of crime, especially in poor areas. This film takes place in the slums, as they say in the subtitled version of the film that I saw, but based on what I read online would be considered the favelas. I'm not super well versed when it comes down to what those terms are in Brazil, so I don't want to say something that would be offensive or come across incorrect, but from what I was reading online, the film takes place in the favelas. If I'm wrong about that, definitely leave some comments down below and let me know. I read something saying that it's, I guess, similar to our version of the hood, but again, I don't know the terminology perfectly, so I don't want to be disrespectful in any way, shape, or form. But the base gist is that the film takes place in low-income, poverty-driven areas that are just ridden with crime and violence, and the film just shows us a slew of characters that are stuck within that world. No way to get out on a monetary level, no way to get out because they're trapped within the power struggle of the violence. And we see how some people end up succumbing to this violence by dying, some people end up getting lost in it because they're afraid to leave, and some people just become absolutely power hungry. Most notably, the character of Little Z, who we see earlier in the film as the character of Little Dice. And I gotta say immediately, the two actors who play this character from a young age to an older age are phenomenal. As Little Dice, you have Douglas Silva, and as Lil Z, you have Leandro Firmino. And man, they are so good in this film, the two of them. They do a great job playing the same character, and you see this individual who was young and was raised around the violence and fell in love with it. He had a thirst for blood, and he grew into this kind of power hungry criminal, this power hungry gangster. And in a lot of ways, this film reminded me of a lot of the hood films that we have here in the States. It reminded me in some ways of things like Menace to Society in a lot of ways as well. And first of all, what I have to say about this film on a filmmaking level is that it's incredibly well made. The sound design, the cinematography, the color palette of the film, the performances across the board, and just the overall look and feel of this film is incredible. On top of that, the wardrobe throughout, because this is a period piece as well. It came out in the early 2000s, but the film takes place between the late 60s and the early 1980s, so you do kind of have to keep up with the different attire that we had in different times like that, especially in Brazil. So between the vehicles that are around, the buildings that are around, and the costuming, I think they did a great job of making it feel like it took place in those days, especially when I've seen like imagery or other movies and different things like that that take place in that time. And I think that for the most part, they captured all that really well. There's a lot of blood in this film as well, so all the makeup effects in this film are pretty solid as well. But when it really comes down to the way that this film is put together, when it comes down to cinematography, performances, and editing, I mean, it is incredibly well done. I was really impressed by it because you never know how you're gonna feel sometimes, especially with an early 2000s film. Of course, there was fantastic films being made for decades even before the early 2000s, but the 2000s has a very specific feel to it. Even some of the best movies that can be a little bit cheesy by today's standards, and I think that this film does an incredible job of kind of having that timeless energy to it. It does a great job of telling a realistic story that doesn't come across goofy in any way, shape, or form, or even dated in its filmmaking. It feels artistic, it feels really stylized, and that's something I really enjoyed about it immediately. The way the camera moved in a lot of these sequences added to the tension as well as the claustrophobic moments that are in this film, and there's moments that are also really kind of scary in a lot of ways in terms of the way these characters are portrayed. There's these characters in the film, most notably characters like Little Z and the various characters that go around him, his gang. There are sequences and shots with them that if I was caught in a situation with these characters, it would be horrifying, it would be menacing, and I think that the performers do an incredible job to really convey that. And then you add in things like the filmmaking, like the cinematography and all that other stuff that really just kind of adds and works together to make some pretty tense scenes. And I really thought that that element of the film made it so captivating. To be completely honest, I sat down to watch this film and I was feeling a little bit tired. My eyes were a little heavy, but I wanted to watch the films, but I was a little worried that maybe I was gonna get sleepy and maybe have to turn it off and finish it another time. But the second I sat down and this movie started playing out, from the first like 5 to 10 minutes, my eyes just widened up. And that's one of my favorite things when you're watching a movie. When you sit down to watch a movie that you're a little tired for beforehand, but as soon as the movie picks up and things are really good, you just find that your eyes kind of widen up. That's exactly how this film felt for me, where I found myself becoming more and more awake as the movie was playing out, as the movie really did grip me from beginning to end, and it really just tells a really tragic story. It's a movie that isn't necessarily asking you to get fully invested in every character. It's not a movie that's necessarily developing every character individually, but instead allowing you to spend time with certain characters and in their world to just kind of see what it was like, you know, what kind of terror characters would have to deal with, or people would deal with in situations like this. And coming from a country that has a lot of gang violence and definitely has had some, you know, history of gang violence, you know, I know that Brazil has had its own, so I can't necessarily speak exactly to how true it is when from this film to the real life stuff, but I did see that this film is based on a true story and based on a novel by Paulo Lins, who apparently says this is a semi-biographical film that tells a true life story and that all the characters in the film are inspired by true life people and true life events. So if that is the case and you guys know more context about that, definitely leave some comments down below and let me know, fill in the gap for me, if you will. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting because it felt realistic. And one of the things that I've said in my reviews recently for some of the Brazilian films I've covered is that the performances just feel so realistic. Again, you have a lot of that here in the States and in other places as well, but what I've really enjoyed about Brazilian filmmaking thus far, the ones that I've seen, is that the filmmaking just feels so real. The performances feel so real. These feel like real people, which makes these scenes with these characters who are menacing feel just that much more menacing, that much more scary. And on the flip side, the characters that you really feel for, that you feel sad for, you ultimately feel just as sad for them or even more sad for them because they do feel like real people. And I think that this film in a lot of ways also does a good job of showcasing how there are characters who you can feel really positively about in one part of the film and then start to feel really negatively about. And that's where the film really showcases how the cyclical nature of violence can really corrupt individuals. You have characters in this film who are good people for a percentage of the film, who want to stay away from the gang violence, who want nothing to do with it, but the gang violence in that world ends up finding them and ultimately kind of draws out vengeance in them, anger in them, or finds them just roped up in the violence themselves, even if they wanted nothing to do with it. And I think that this film really tackles the way that surroundings like this can really corrupt not only the youth, which is a huge part of this film, as we see kids in the film who are being pulled into these gangs at super young ages because they think it's cool, because they like the idea of this power, and they end up growing into these incredibly vindictive and violent people, but also seeing how there's adults who have lived their lives, who want to be good people, but the violence and the crime eventually pulls them into what's going on. And if they don't want to be pulled into it, they end up being killed within it all. And so it's really a really scary, sad story in a lot of ways. It's unfortunately a story that a lot of people have had to live through in a lot of these low income areas in all parts of the world, and I think that this film just showcases one other slice to that story. And I think when it comes down to depicting it, yeah, it's done incredibly well. The performances are so good from beginning to end, and I just think that's something I'm loving the most about Brazilian filmmaking. It's nice to see the cinematography, it's nice to see the different styles, it's nice to see stories that are told with a different lens and a different voice, of course, but what I'm really enjoying is seeing these performances that just feel so tangible and so real, that can be something that you can really tap into on an emotional level, and things that you can also be quite afraid of at times too when it comes down to a movie like this. So yeah, for what this film had to say in terms of the cyclical nature of violence and seeing the various characters we see in the mix of this and how they get lost within that darkness, I thought was really great. And I think it's interesting also how they chose to handle the character of Rocket as our lead protagonist, because he's not a protagonist in the traditional sense. You know, we're not following the whole movie through his eyes. He's narrating portions of the film where we won't see him for 10 minutes of the movie, because we're focusing on other characters that he's kind of giving us the narration about, and now we're watching these scenes play out. And so the film has a few characters that you could almost call the main character or one of the main characters, but Rocket is the main one. But I thought it was an interesting, like, unconventional approach to have him be this protagonist who's narrating, but that the film isn't always focusing on, and we don't see everything through his eyes. It's a lot of the stories and chapters that the film is kind of using to tell this story, and I thought that was just really well done. I thought it was handled well in a lot of ways, and I really enjoyed that. Now that I've praised the filmmaking, the performances, the themes that the film has, and the various things that it's about, one thing I do want to say in terms of my gripes is that there were a slew of characters that I wish we spent a little bit more time with. Most notably characters like Benny or Angelica. I really thought they were going to do more with their characters. I understand what they did with them and why they chose to go that route. It's an impactful scene in the movie. There's a big party scene in the film where things get crazy, especially around the character of Benny and Lil Z. I really enjoyed that element of the film. I thought that was a real big tension heavy scene. I was glued to the screen throughout the entirety of that scene, and everything about the lighting and how it was staged and the way the camera angles are used and the different editing shots that are throughout the course of that sequence really added to the tension of it. But Angelica, based on the poster and some of the images I saw, looked like she was going to be a bigger part of the movie, especially with how she's set up in the early part of the movie. And then it felt like, once that whole party scene happens with Benny and Lil Z, she just is kind of removed from the story altogether. And there was a couple of characters throughout the course of the movie that I wish we just expanded upon a little bit more, that we spent a little bit more time with. And then outside of that, there were just a handful of moments in the film where I felt like the story meandered ever so slightly, where we were just kind of going through the motions, maybe doing some of the same things here and there. There's maybe like 10 minutes of this movie that I would have probably just like shortened just a little bit. But honestly, these are pretty minor gripes in a film that I thought was really, really well done. Similar to the other ones that I've watched recently from Brazil, the film's subject matter is so serious and so dark that I can't necessarily see myself revisiting this film often, but it's definitely a movie I would watch again. It's definitely a film I would want to show somebody in the future who's never seen it before, because it was really, really well done on a filmmaking level and on a performance level. It had things to say, it was dark, but also had these moments of light within it as well. And I think that it had really interesting characters that made the film consistently engaging to watch, that felt realistic. I love a good film that feels fun and hokey. I love a good film that feels theatrical, but there is nothing like a realistic drama where you feel like you're absolutely in these sequences because the performers are doing such a great job of elevating the material with incredibly realistic performances. And that's exactly what you have here. I think City of God is absolutely a fantastic film, not just a fantastic Brazilian film, a fantastic film that people should check out. I'm shocked that it took me this long to see it. I'm ashamed that it took me this long to see it, but I'm happy that kind of diving into Brazilian cinema right now has led to me finally watching this film. So like I did in the last video, I want to ask for more recommendations. I do have a list of some of those that you guys already left me in the last video, so I will try to get to those as well as time goes on, but feel free to leave more recommendations below. What other Brazilian films should I dive into? And I even had some comments in the last one saying that there are some bad Brazilian films. Feel free to leave some comments down below. What are some bad Brazilian films that I should watch? Something that I should watch that I can just laugh at and see the complete opposite side of the filmmaking in Brazil. But either way, a big thanks to everybody who's been supporting my videos recently, specifically the Brazilian videos, because that's what prompted me to do this. But a big thanks to everybody who's just been loving the channel recently. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I really enjoyed this film. If you've never seen City of God, I highly recommend it. Anyway, I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, bye bye.